G7 nations agreed to begin taxing multinational corporations. I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. A slogan like tax the rich has rightfully so become a meme, something that is quite commonly spoken by young people or those further on the left side of the political spectrum. But we all have to admit, there is some cases where it does make sense, and today we're going to talk about one such instance. It is reported that the G7 nations have agreed in principle to a global minimum corporate tax rate of 15% to avoid countries undercutting each other and to ensure they get some revenue from the likes of Facebook, Google, and Amazon. Those tech giants are the ones who are supposedly going to be the most affected by this change. Now, before we move along in the story, I think it's pretty evident that these companies are notorious for doing things like avoiding taxes, and that's why this is an important progression. You have likely seen headlines like Facebook and Apple have made billions of dollars this year, but on their taxes they've paid zero. Well, how is that possible? There are a couple of tricks in the book, but one of the more common ones is basically setting up something like a shell or a PO box, a subsidiary, whatever, in one country or jurisdiction where the tax rates are low or non-existent, and then the company declares all of the profits in that location. So let's say, to give a simple example, you operate in Canada and Ireland, because I do believe Ireland has a 0% corporate profit rate or something like that. On the off chance I've confused them with another country, it doesn't really matter because this is just a hypothetical example anyways. So let's say you do operate in Ireland and Canada, and all of your sales actually do happen in Canada, but you have a PO box in Ireland, and you're established as a corporation there too. So, the tax rate in Canada is far higher. Do you really want to be out 30-something% of your profits to the government? Well, I assume not. So what do? You just say, I didn't actually make this profit in Canada. I declared everything in Ireland. Therefore, it's income that should be paid to the Irish government. And what's their tax rate? Well, it's about 0%. Canada, you have no claim to that. That's Ireland income. And that's the game they play. Or one of the games they play. There are other ways to go about this too. You must note as well that when there's a report that comes out that revenues were this high but taxes were that low, well, most companies aren't actually taxed on revenue. They're taxed on profit. And there are ways to make your profit much smaller than they otherwise should be. And here's where some fancy accounting comes into play. There are things you can do to raise your expenses, which would inherently reduce your profits, even though that doesn't really depict reality. Now, I don't know the ins and outs of that, but I do know it's possible. And you also have an army of lawyers who are hitting the books day after day, trying to find these loopholes and exceptions that the companies can abuse. Now, with that combination of things, it's no wonder these companies can get away with paying the government nothing. Now, as a result of that, we have countries like America, the UK, France, Germany, Canada, Italy, and Japan, plus the rest of the EU, who are coming out with this agreement. And they're saying this plan to establish a standard tax for multinational corporations could see billions of dollars flow into governments to pay off debts such as the ones we've incurred during the COVID crisis, and I support that. These really are taxes that should have been paid to the government from the get-go. They can try to feign ignorance and say, the corporations, that the revenues were generated and declared in this country and that country and playing with the fancy accounting, but the reality of the situation is these corporations operate in countries like Canada and America. They make money in countries like Canada and America, but they pay no taxes in countries like Canada and America. And that doesn't make any sense at all. Clearly, a fix has to be discovered here. It's been going on for far too long. Now, of course, the devils are in the details here. It's not like just because the G7 nations have agreed to this that tomorrow we're going to wake up and the corporations will be paying forward these billions of dollars and everything will be peachy. So, one of the things to keep in mind is that the G7 does not encompass every country in the world. Just because these bigger ones have agreed to something doesn't mean the rest will. How about the G20, which includes the likes of China and Russia? Are they going to be on board? Well, that's questionable. And there truly isn't a way to force them to be on board. You can try to coerce them, you can try to impose economic sanctions and whatnot, but those are big boy countries. And if they don't want to take part, they won't. And there are even smaller countries, like some of the ones we've seen in the Caribbean, who may continue to operate as tax havens. Now, just because the G7 has a standard tax rate, what if I operate outside of that as a corporation? What if Google moves their offices from Ireland to some island where they would still get that 0% tax rate? So it may simply be an issue with a corporation being allowed to declare profits where they want. That may need to be tinkered with directly. And the standard tax may also need to be a part of the solution. So there are things to consider there. The G7 nations were worried about themselves undercutting each other, but there are many players at the table here. And many players who would love the chance to undercut these larger countries and get a piece of the tech pie. Now, many people would oppose what I'm saying, and particularly those more on the right, more conservative people. And they would say things like, well, we don't really like taxes that much. There are other benefits that these corporations produce, like jobs. They employ so many people in Canada and America and Europe. Investment. They help these countries develop. They help them grow. It's not like that we're getting no income from them. Just because they don't pay taxes on their profit doesn't mean they're paying nothing. There are income taxes that the employees get as a product of the company that the government gets revenue on. There are purchasing and other agreements and trades and transactions that perhaps produce taxes for the government. So the income tax is one part of it, but maybe not everything. And they would say doing something to anger these companies may not be the smartest thing, because do you really want to lose them? And there is something to say about that argument, but it's not entirely correct. The bottom line here is that the opportunity cost is not large enough to make them stop operating and giving these benefits to a country like Canada and America. These companies make billions of dollars of profits every year in various places around the world. Let's say a company like Google is making something like $10 billion in profit every year operating in North America. Now look at the proposal. If we say from that 10 billion profit, we don't really want you declaring it in Ireland or wherever, we're going to standardize across the board that 15% is going to go to North America. So you have 10 billion, 15% of that, 1.5 billion. That's a lot of money. Now, the corporation still made $8.5 billion that goes into their pocket. Are they really going to pack up shop, have a massive outburst, take away all those jobs and those benefits over that, even though they're still massively profitable? I'm not too sure. I'm not too sure they want to sabotage their relations with those countries over something like a 15% corporate tax. Now, if it was something like 80%, then we have a problem, and then I'd be opposing that. But to me, there's nothing unreasonable about what's being put forward. It's simply getting them on par with how a company should operate in these countries. We're not creating unique rules for them. We're trying to stop them from applying unique rules to themselves. We want them to play the game that every other company and business does in Canada. You operate here, you make money here, pay up, your fair share. That's how it should be. That's not a radical proposal. Now, in some ways, what we're seeing here is akin to what employees do when they create a union. The bottom line is we need to get out of this rat race to the bottom. Countries trying to undercut each other to ribbons, and it actually works to the detriment of everyone. Now, to the union example, think about this. Let's say there are 5 employees, and you can picture the employees as the government, actually, and the one employer. And you can picture them as Google. Now, Google is trying to hire someone. They're trying to work with someone. And let's say that for the potential employees, they have a standard. They want to get paid $80,000 a year for the duty, for the job that's being put forward. Now, the 5th member, they don't seem to realize that by playing along, it actually stands to benefit everyone in some way. They're looking at it from a selfish interest, and this is akin to the prisoner's dilemma. And their actions are going to work to the detriment of everyone on average. So they're going to say, well, 80,000, yeah, that's about how much I'm worth, but I want this job and I'm going to play dirty at it. So I go to Google and I say, hey, I'll actually do the job for 50K. And then maybe another country sees that and they say, well, we really do need Google here, so we'll do it for 40K. and it's a rat race at the bottom now. How low can you go? Some countries went as low as 0%. And why are they going to do that? Well, maybe it benefits them to have that Google stamp on their resume. They can attract further talent, innovation, and investment, and other indirect benefits that we've talked about by having these corporations, quote unquote, operating in those tax haven countries. Now, here's where the union part comes in. Now the G7 countries are saying, hey, forget this rat race to the bottom. We should just set a standard so all of us can benefit practically from doing business with these companies. They got together and they said, hey, the minimum that we're willing to accept is 15%. Google, you can go here, you can go there, you can go wherever you want. You're not going to get lower than that. So, if you want to do business here, you have to pay up. Now the bargaining power has shifted. The dynamic has changed. In the original example, all the bargaining power was with the multinational. Now because you have a united front, the bargaining power has shifted back to you, the countries, and that's a good thing. We do want a fair balance, and having the power shifted all the way in favor of the multinationals, we've seen the consequences of that. We've seen the $0 in profit, taxes derived from profit given to the government, and that's not ideal. So the power dynamic has to change a little bit to make sure things are fair and equitable, and that's using the terms in the right way. And there is a side point here to be made as well. Maybe it's just a case that governments need to grow a backbone. All too often they bend to corporate powers, and we can take some examples in Canada. You have the CRTC, the institution that's supposedly supposed to be looking out for the interests of the Canadian consumer in the telecom industry. What have they done? They bent to the corporate powers many, many times to the detriment of the people they're supposed to be serving. You can look at all their decisions, even the most recent repealing of the wholesale internet rates to make the industry less competitive, to concentrate power back in the current oligopoly structure, so the big three doesn't lose their footing. Doing things like making it hard for phone companies to get access to the networks. We have the likes of TechSavvy and previously Freedom Mobile who are complaining about that. This organization puts a mask on and they say they're looking out for the consumer, but really they're looking out for the corporation. And if you analyze the trend of multinationals and their relationships with the government, in some ways the government has played that same game, not putting in an effort to truly figure out the tax situation, bending over backwards to make things work for them. It's unnecessary. The government has to get a backbone here. As we've talked about, these companies make so much money from a place like Canada. Are they going to pack up their bags because they're making slightly less? As long as they're still making their billions, I think they'll be happy. And if they're not, well, it is a free market. Competition will theoretically fill the void, so you're not losing too much there, especially in the long run. You also have other nonsense that Canada is partaking in, like this Bill C-10. Trudeau has really dropped the ball on that. They've gone as far as trying to stifle debate on the bill, because they know how insidious it is, and any further talk on it is just going to produce bad publicity. It's insane, and it seems like the government is working once again on behalf of the corporate interests, and not something that's good for the people. And if it's not the people who are backing it, supporting it, calling for it, then who is? And that's the question that you have to be wondering. When it comes down to decision making and generating revenue for the government, which we know they need, especially in the wake of all this COVID spending, it seems like they would much rather opt to do things like tax the individuals and small businesses rather than getting corporations to even pay a penny. It took them years to get to this 15% corporate tax mandate. It took them years to get these corporations to start paying even a minor percentage of their profits and their revenues back to the government. We're in the midst of a spending bubble when it comes to government expenditure, and to not be looking into these sources of revenue that should have been here many, many years ago, it'd be a complete dropping of the ball. So at least they got moving on it, but this should have been something that was looked into a long time ago. The coalition of the G7 and further expanding it to the G20, it takes time. And that should have been looked into, once again, a very long time ago. But now I do believe that looking at the balance sheet, the government around the world are saying, well, we're pretty screwed actually. After the billions and in some instances trillions of dollars that they've put in to keep their countries afloat, They really do need big tech and multinationals to put in their fair share. So it's something I want to see happen, and hopefully this is the beginning of that. There are some issues to continue to work out, like we've talked about. Having the G7 on board is one thing, but how about the G20? And how about the other countries around the world outside of that? Then further, how are we going to make sure that the corporations actually play the game that we've laid out? With their army of lawyers, isn't there a chance that they find another way to circumvent the rules? Maybe. Well, in that case, you alter the rules again, and you make it harder for them to do that. It does seem like there will need to be some back and forth to really figure things out and iron out all the problems with the tax code, but as always, I will keep you up to date on that, and I do think we will see significant progress coming down not too far from now. So that brings us to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a review and share. That will help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.